Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Delighted to have with us one of our friends from CAP, Lily Roberts, who leads the Inclusive Growth Project. Welcome, Lily. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. We want to talk about this big, horrible, grotesque bill and its implications, as you say, on inclusive growth. Let's start with kind of a basic definitional issue. What is inclusive growth, and why do we want inclusive growth as a country?
So the idea of inclusive growth is that issues like healthcare, like wages, like food assistance, those are all parts of building a strong country and building a strong economy. And that everybody benefits when sort of the most vulnerable people, when kids, with people with disabilities who can't be in the labor market, when all of those people can thrive, when they can all do their best, we all benefit. So inclusive growth is really this idea of we don't need to worry as much about dividing up the pre-existing pie. We need to grow the pie and worry about making sure that everyone's getting their fair share, and that we can really do both. And we have some tools that we know how to use to do both.
In the Biden administration, for example, one of the initiatives was the bipartisan infrastructure plan. Another was the so-called CHIPS plan. Talk about how those fit in the inclusive growth model.
Yeah, so both of those looked at parts of the country that sort of needed an economic boost. They needed new jobs. They needed new partnerships between community colleges and employers. And they found ways to make those matches and to hire folks to do those jobs. But they weren't just sort of like any job. They were jobs that we knew were important for economic competitiveness around the world, that were important for long-term growth. Industries that have really sort of quickly growing trajectories that are going to be really important in the future. So chips manufacturing, semiconductors. And we know that when we invest in that kind of economic work, obviously the people who get those jobs benefit, but those communities benefit too. The people who go to the community college, the people who, provide the services in the town where folks now have higher wages so they can, use more services and buy more goods. Economic communities thrive when we have those kinds of investments.
The bill passed by the House has a very distinctive framework, and that is to give massive tax cuts to the rich and very disproportionately the rich, and to make huge cuts in things like green energy, which would go back
Mhm.
to the CHIPS Act and to some extent the Infrastructure Act, make huge cuts in Medicaid and make huge cuts in SNAP. Talk about how that undercuts inclusive growth, not only for the people who are affected, but for the entire country.
Yeah, so the top line of this bill is at a time when we've had, a decade of conversations about rising costs for families. This bill kicks 14 million people off their health insurance, and it kicks 11 million people off their food assistance. 4 million of those are kids. Um, that is just totally antithetical to this idea of how to invest in a strong and growing economy. Those numbers are, I think we're going to talk about sort of what that means at the individual level in a minute here. But I also want to note that that doesn't just affect the people who use Medicaid or use food assistance. Even though, obviously it's millions and millions of people who use those individually, as well as even more family members or community members who benefit. But the bigger issue here is that those are big enough numbers that they could have serious issues for our economy writ large. So, for example, maybe you aren't individually on SNAP, but SNAP is a really important what economists call automatic stabilizer. So in an economic downturn, people need more SNAP. They lose a job, they need a little bit more food assistance to keep food on the table for them and their family. They've lost their job, they're lost their wages. SNAP is something that injects cash into the economy really quickly. People spend it on a really restricted list of food items. They spend it in their local community, and they spend it really immediately. So SNAP is something that keeps recessions from becoming depressions. And there are a lot of, there are millions of people who will lose those benefits because of this bill, but the economy overall will suffer. The grocery store owners will suffer. The community members who would benefit from people in their community not going hungry will suffer. And our economy will sort of continue to spiral downward because we don't have this really important system that we've relied on for decades.
If people lose Medicaid, for example, you're going to see them not get preventive health care. They're going to miss more work. They will show up in emergency rooms, drawing down state resources. Talk a little bit about kind of the ripple effect of Medicaid cuts, even beyond the people who are affected.
Yeah, so there's this concept of uncompensated care. Your cancer doesn't go away because you don't have health insurance. So even if you avoid because you can't pay for it, you're avoiding that preventative care. Your disease or the condition you have might get worse and worse and worse until you really just show up in the ER and you're desperately in need of care. The hospital is going to provide that care. The doctors have a duty to provide that care, but the hospital is going to go uncompensated for it. We know that especially rural hospitals right now are really struggling. All across the country, there are hundreds of rural hospitals that are sort of teetering on the brink of closure. They've had multiple years of sort of financial stress, and they've got very low reserves. And we actually have estimates of many, many hospitals, states across the country that could close because so many of their patients right now are on Medicaid. Many people in rural areas use Medicaid. And so, if that payment source dries up, many hospitals are at risk of closure. That doesn't just affect the people who are on Medicaid, it affects all the people who work at the hospital, it affects the community that can depend on that care. If you suddenly have to drive 40, 50, 60 minutes to get to the nearest hospital, that's really going to be, first of all, stressful. Second of all, very dangerous for people with accidents or chronic conditions or anything where they need to get to a hospital very quickly. I certainly might have had a baby in a car if I hadn't been able to get to a hospital pretty quickly.
And just to emphasize 2 points, I think the figure that CAP has used is close to 200 hospitals could close. And of course, we know that in rural communities, hospitals are often the main employer. So if they shut down and change, you see an economic collapse within that entire city and, in fact, beyond the region. Let's drill down, as you mentioned, to a couple really extraordinary examples that kind of highlight what you've been talking about. Let's take Maine, for example. Susan Collins is up for re-election next year. So she might be interested to note that something like 31,000 residents could be losing SNAP benefits. We're talking about 166,000 students losing access to free lunches. Talk a little bit about what that does in Maine, which has had a rural poverty problem already. What kind of hits does Maine take when that sort of bill passes?
Yeah, so one of the really insidious parts of how this bill is structured is that it's tackling SNAP's federal status for the first time. So food stamps or SNAP have always been a program that is paid for by the federal government. So states administer it. They might issue the little debit card that folks get. They're able to make rules about sort of access to school meals. So Maine has made this wonderful choice that all students in Maine get access to free school meals. It's easier for the school districts to administer. It reduces the stigma of having to use a different card or a stamp. They've shown that it has incredible educational impacts, right? It's really paying off for Maine's schools and Maine's students. But this bill, because it would change the funding formula and would pass costs off to the state, suddenly Maine is on the hook to pay many of the benefits that people in Maine are receiving every month. And that would also change the eligibility thresholds for SNAP. So many students would lose access to SNAP, and that threatens everybody's access because then they can't sort of calculate access the same way that they used to. Many states across the country have said that they will just simply not be able to make up the difference. If the federal government pulls out, whether it's 5% or 25%, and those are sort of the numbers being thrown around, they're going to pull out a ton of their federal funding. That's millions and millions of dollars that states don't have on hand. And going back to sort of how I was starting this, states have to balance their budget every year. And in a time of recession, states' tax revenues go down pretty dramatically. And so if you're facing an employment crisis in your state, if you're facing, something like COVID that we had a couple of years ago, right? Like you're losing those tax revenues and suddenly you have to pay a lot more in SNAP benefits. You're just not going to be able to do that. And one of the options is that states could opt out of SNAP altogether. So we've sort of been talking about conservative estimates here of how many individuals could lose benefits, but the consequences for the states are really, really dramatic. At the very least, they're going to have to find that money somewhere else in their budget. And again, it's hundreds of millions of dollars every year.
If they're spending money on that, they can't spend money on something that a non-SNAP beneficiary might want, or they might have to raise taxes on everybody. So any kind of tax cut that Trump is promising, and there are not that many millionaires and billionaires in Maine, might wind up as a net tax increase because they're not getting that much from the feds, and suddenly state taxes might have to go
Yeah,
up.
absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about another state which has a senator who should be more concerned with that, and that is North Carolina. Tom Tillis, you're up for reelection. What are you doing? Not only has that state, frankly, benefited by a lot of the green energy investment, but the Medicaid impacts could be tremendous. You're talking about over 500,000 people might lose access to Medicaid. We're talking about 12% of the hospitals that are already at risk of closure could go under. Talk about the ramifications in North Carolina, which we've always thought of as a growing technological hub, as someplace where good jobs can be found and that they're on the escalator to a better, stronger middle class.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at just the green energy jobs alone. That's about 20,000 jobs that would be at risk. And even if you don't work in that sector, you'd be looking at higher utility prices. So $215 a year in increased electricity prices. That's just as soon we know that like AI is using a lot of energy, right? The Research Triangle is a growing place in North Carolina. It needs the utilities and reliability there. So this bill really sort of hits at something that is just underpinning economic growth. But I think Medicaid is really crucial to talk about in North Carolina. And I was thinking about how 500,000 people. It's sort of incomprehensible. It's hard to get our minds around numbers this big. But one of the sort of most salient facts that I think we can come back to is that that translates to 579 avoidable deaths in North Carolina every year. Because we know that if people lose health coverage, they can't get it elsewhere. They can't afford it. So many of them will go without health coverage. Many of those people will go without treatment because they can't afford it. Many of those people who go without treatment will die. And unfortunately, we can do the math, and that's 579 for the state of North Carolina every year. It's unbelievable to think about making a political choice that will kill 579 of your constituents, that will, leave holes in those families, in those communities every year for something as simple a trade as tax cuts that won't trickle down, that won't benefit your state, that will, be great news for a handful of millionaires, but that for 579 of your constituents are a death sentence.
Well, one of the things that people always ask us is what can ordinary people do? It would seem that there are a bunch of senators where the bill is now under consideration. Iowa, Joni Ernst will be on the ballot in 2 years or less than 2 years. Tom Tillis, we've talked about. Susan Collins, we've talked about. What can people from those states or even people from other states do to reach out to those people to try to influence their decisions as they consider the House bill?
I think that it's really important for folks to know that they don't have to wait for the ballot box to make their voices heard. They can share their personal experiences with Medicaid and SNAP. They can share how important they are for their community. I think everybody knows, even if you aren't personally on Medicaid, maybe you've got someone who's benefiting from long term care. Most of those folks are paid for by Medicaid, even if you're also on Medicare. Right? There are a lot of ways that our healthcare system, in particular, Medicaid, really underpins a lot of it. So many programs that folks use in substance abuse, in long term care, all sorts of things really are underpinned by Medicaid. So I would share your personal story and educate the lawmakers around you and your community members about how important this is. And I think it's important for folks too to share with their friends and family that this matters to them, that this is an important political moment, that it's something that makes their life better. And it's, something that many folks turn to Medicaid and SNAP in hard times, and then they're not on them anymore. So folks might not know that they've used those programs in the past. And it's important to talk about that and share with your community, with your policymakers, so that they know how important a choice this is for you.
Absolutely. And I think you just made an additional point that people may not be aware of for all of those folks in the so-called sandwich generation. They may have elderly parents. Their long-term care is paid for in many cases by Medicaid. And if that goes away, they're going to be in the position of having to care for an elderly relative. So there are so many aspects of this bill that impact people in many ways. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, as an entire country, we would be hurt by this because what you've talked about is not only the direct beneficiaries, but the ripple effect on what you've described as the inclusive growth problem that we already had. So thank you so much, Lily. We'll enjoy having you back as we progress through the consideration of this bill. And I would want to remind our friends out, our contrarians, that one of the ways that you can register your concern is to show up on No King's Day on the 14th. This is a peaceful demonstration, not only against political tyranny, but against this notion that we're some kind of oligarchy where all the benefits should go to the very wealthy. So thank you again, Lily. Thank you, contrarians. And remember, have your voices heard now and on No King's Day. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.